Comments on Dennett. Professor Dennett suggests that we can study consciousness empirically by keeping track of the linguistic behavior of organisms, which are believed to be conscious. This proposal will strike some people as obvious, but there are some to whom it will seem evidently false. Some philosophers, like Gabriel, Marcel, and Thomas Nagel, cling to a sense of mystery, which they believe distinguishes philosophy from science. They will say that Dennett has once again managed to miss the point about consciousness, namely that it lies beyond the reach of language and can only be known from the inside. To illuminate the disagreement between Dennett and this sort of opponent, I would like to point out some analogies between the problem of how to study consciousness empirically and that of how to study motion empirically. It is widely believed nowadays that one can study motion empirically by plotting the positions, over a sequence of times, of those bodies which are believed to move. But there have been many philosophers who viewed this suggestion as simple-minded, as failing to realize that motion had an inside as well as an outside, a very mysterious inside. Aristotle, in defining motion as the actualization of the potential qua potential, wished to link natural motion, the paradigm case of motion, standing to violent motion as zombies to humans, to the notion of substance. For him, natural motion, including growth, qualitative change, and change of place, was to be understood by reference to the more fundamental fact of substantial change, the actualization of the potential tout court, rather than merely qua potential. Descartes followed Galileo in mocking this Aristotelian definition, saying that it was unintelligible, and that no definition was necessary, since everyone knows what motion is. Leibniz, however, retreated to the Aristotelian view, arguing that motion required a metaphysical treatment, in terms of the élan vital of monads, as well as a mathematico-physical treatment. In our century, this Leibnizian claim has been restated by Bergson, James, Whitehead, Weiss, and a host of others sympathetic to the idea of process as a fundamental category. For Bergsonians and other process philosophers, the sheer whooshiness of motion is simply ignored by modern science, just as for Nagel, the sheer what it is to be likeness of consciousness is ignored. In the end, Bergson thought, motion can only be understood from the first-person point of view, by actually whooshing about a bit, in order to remind oneself what it is like. Whereas Aristotle had contrasted natural and violent motion, Bergson made his point by contrasting absolute with relative motion. I quote from the beginning of his Introduction to Metaphysics. Consider, for example, the movement of an object in space. My perception of the motion will vary with the point of view, moving or stationary, from which I observe it. I call such motion relative. But when I speak of an absolute movement, I am attributing to the moving object an interior, and, so to speak, states of mind. I also imply that I am in sympathy with those states, and that I insert myself in them by effort of imagination. In the following paragraph, Bergson applies the same relative-absolute distinction to express Nagel's distinction between third and first-person points of view. Consider again a character whose adventures are related in a novel. The author may multiply the traits of his hero's character, may make him speak and act as much as he pleases, but all this can never be equivalent to the simple and indivisible feeling which I experience if I were able for an instant to identify myself with the person of the hero himself. Symbols and points of view place me outside him. They give me only what he has in common with others, but that which is properly himself, that which constitutes his essence, cannot be perceived from without, being internal by definition, nor be expressed by symbols, being incommensurable with everything else. Description, history, and analysis leave me here in the relative. Coincidence with the person himself would alone give me the absolute. Bergson sums up this contrast by contrasting metaphysics as the science which claims to dispense with symbols. Elsewhere, he contrasts this discipline with the Galilean sort of science, which takes a cinematographical view of motion and behavioristic view of consciousness. Those philosophers who gave up on absolute motion and are content with relative motion tend to justify their claim by some version of pragmatism. They say that to grasp the relations between a given state of the universe, or some subdivision thereof, and all the other states, is all they need to grasp in order to do what they want to do, namely predict and control. So it is nothing to them if we are really at rest when we think we are moving, or conversely, for they do not see what really could usefully be made to mean in this context. The same sort of philosopher is tempted to give up on the first-person view of consciousness. He does so because he does not see what really could usefully be made to mean in a sentence like, "He behaves, and always will behave, like a gifted mathematician and raconteur, but really is a zombie." Such philosophers are inclined to think that if you can relate all his bodily states, including those of his larynx and writing hand, to all the other states of all the other bodies in the universe, or at least the neighborhood, you know all you want to know. Whether you use an intentional vocabulary or a vocabulary of inner representations to do so is not metaphysically significant, since the point of such a vocabulary is simply to establish more perspicuous connections between such states. Using mentalistic concepts to talk about people carries no more metaphysical commitments than using the concepts of the calculus to talk about particles. It is just a useful jargon for the purpose at hand. Dennett and I are both philosophers of this non-metaphysical sort, so I am not about to quarrel with the substance of what he has said in his paper. I shall, however, quarrel with some of his turns of phrase. I do so in order to make the point that the real problem is not how to study consciousness empirically, but to convince people that studying it is, from a methodological point of view, just like studying anything else. The problem is not to take account of the special difficulty raised by the inside character of consciousness, but to convince people that there is no reason to grant that persons have more of an inside than particles. Thus, when Dennett uses the terms text and hermeneutics, I am inclined to say that data would do as well as text and explanation, as well as hermeneutics. To interpret a text is to put it into a context, to relate it to various things, the conventions of the day, events contemporary with its composition, the author's intentions, various other texts you've read, the problems of your own life, or whatever. To explain some data is to do just the same thing, except that in this case there are more constraints on the kinds of things to which you relate it. Your own problems usually don't come into the picture, for example. Explanation is not opposed to, but is a special case of, understanding. The attempt to predict and control is a special case of interpretation. This may seem a quibble, but I think it is important to avoid the idea that, in Dennett's phrase, when you get to the traditional domains of hermeneutics, you are in controversial and treacherous territory. The only reason it might look more controversial is that there are more possibilities for insisting that putting the data into relation to these things is the right interpretation. But no up-to-date practitioner of hermeneutics, the sort who agrees with Derrida that there is no transcendental signified, and with Gadamer that all readings are prejudiced, would be caught dead talking about the right interpretation. He avoids this for the same reason that the up-to-date operationalist in the sciences avoids saying, "Now I have discovered the true nature, the real essence, the very quiddity of the object I have been trying to understand." This is because the hermeneutical attitude recommended by Heidegger and Gadamer and the operationalist attitude recommended by Mach are the same attitude. They are different applications of the doctrine that neither texts nor people nor anything else have essences, or insides, or natures, or true meanings. Each new vocabulary for describing them puts them into a different relation, or relates them to different things. As Goodman says, none of these vocabularies expresses the way the world is. So I would want to say that the button pressings and other responses of the psychological subject are no more or no less a text than the readings on the oscilloscope which record the passing particle. Once we stop worrying about getting inside the mens actoris, or about getting the particle's own view of its career, we can stop thinking that the sciences and the humanities have different methods, and thus might lend each other helping hands. Consider two neat points which Dennett makes with the help of his analogy between the heterophenomenological game and the interpretation of fiction. The first is when he compares reinterpreting a fiction, a la Freud, as an unconscious reference to a real person, with discovering what the heterophenomenological subject is really talking about. The second is when he says that when we ask about the objects of the subject's phenomenological world, what are these objects and what are they made of, we can give the answer, nothing, and gloss this with, what is Mr. Pickwick made of? Nothing. Mr. Pickwick is a fictional object, and so are the objects described, named, mentioned by the phenomenologist. In both cases, it seems to me that Dennett's point depends entirely on assuming a Goodman-esque attitude towards the matter. On the first point, I should prefer to say that no literary interpreter ever discovers who or what an author was really talking about. He just discovers what you can say about the text if you relate it to a certain thing. Nobody, for example, could discover that when Proust described Albertine, he was really talking about his chauffeur, but only that, for certain purposes, you can usefully place Proust's novel in the context of his relation with his chauffeur. Analogously, nobody could discover that we have really been talking about brain states when we thought that we were talking about mental images, but they might discover that once you had related reports of such images to brain states, you could predict the subject's reports of images a good deal better. On the second point, I should want to say that the question, what are these objects? What are they made of? Asked, for example, about mental images, is better stated as the question, does the fact that people sincerely report such objects mean that we must give them a place in our theories? The answer to that question, for a Goodman-esque operationalist, is, it all depends on what you want your theories for. If you just want to predict their behavior, then probably not. This alternative way of putting the matter can be summed up as follows. On the view I am suggesting, any vocabulary for describing anything, particles or persons, is just one vocabulary among others, useful for some purposes, otherwise nobody would have bothered to dream it up, and useless for others. From the viewpoint of some purpose which is different from that for which the vocabulary was originally designed, the original vocabulary will count as a fiction. Thus, Aristotle's and Leibniz's and Bergson's vocabularies for talking about motion are intelligible and coherent, but we don't want them. So we treat the reference of these vocabularies as fictional entities. We reject the questions, what was Aristotelian natural motion anyway? And what was Bergson talking about when he spoke of absolute motion? And what is Nagel talking about when he speaks of the bat's point of view? Just as we reject the question, what was Dickens talking about when he described the actions of Mr. Pickwick? And what was the process which orthodox theologians described as transubstantiation? We reject these questions because in one sense the answer is obvious and trivial. These people were talking about natural motion, absolute motion, the bat's point of view, Mr. Pickwick, and transubstantiation. If you want to know what these are, read the stories in which they occur. In another sense, the answer is equally obvious and trivial, namely, nothing. That answer is shorthand for the purposes relevant to our present conversation, we have no need to use these terms. The Goodman-like viewpoint which I am identifying as pragmatist is one which does not distinguish the study of consciousness from the study of Proust or of protons. Pragmatists see the study of anything as of the same sort. It is an attempt to get a handle on the thing by relating it to something else. This means that the study of consciousness may never mention consciousness, but go direct from brain to behavior and back. That the study of Proust may never mention Proust, as in semiotic treatments of his text, and that the study of particles may never set the wave functions aside and talk about what it is whose behavior is predicted by those functions. To say that it is indeed consciousness, or Proust, or particles which we are studying is merely to say that we are looking at or near some space-time regions which people have called by these names. Our study may lead us to cease calling these regions by these names, as it may lead to dividing space and time up into new regions, not coextensive with those charted previously. But when we do so, we have not discovered, or gotten closer to discovering, such facts as that there is no such thing as natural motion, or absolute motion, or consciousness, or the mens auctoris, or the transcendental signified. We have merely found that we can accomplish something by foregoing the use of one vocabulary and adopting another. As I say in my own paper in this issue, I think that one should see the quarrel between philosophers of mind like me and Dennett, who cannot take worries about zombies seriously, and philosophers like Nagel and Searle, who can, as metaphilosophical rather than substantive. The quarrel is not about the nature of consciousness. It is rather a quarrel about whether we have any purposes which would be served by metaphysics, in Bergson's sense of a science which dispenses with symbols. To claim that we need to dispense with symbols is to say that at some points we aren't free to shift vocabularies for the sake of convenience, because some vocabularies actually get in touch with intuition, with a non-linguistic mode of relating to the essences of objects, as opposed to simply relating these objects to other objects. If one believes that, as Bergson and Nagel do, then one will insist that we need to get back behind language to something non-linguistic, a kind of absolute knowledge. I do not believe that, but I do not know how to argue the point except by making the sort of analogies which I have been trying to develop between the study of motion and the study of consciousness. If one takes this analogy one step further, one might suggest, optimistically, that recent philosophy of mind is doing for the study of inner space what Galileo and Newton did for the rest of space. Inner space was a refuge for our metaphysical hopes, created by Descartes and Locke after Galileo and Newton had made us operationalists about the world beyond the eyeball. The consequences for culture as a whole of the Galilean renunciation of the Aristotelian quest for intrinsic natures have been enormous. But they have, alas, been mitigated by the invention of Cartesian subjectivity as a new topos for absolute knowledge. If we get rid of this topos, if there were no place left at which we might hope to escape from language into intuition, then our culture would become still more un-Aristotelian, still more pragmatic, still more conscious that there is nothing to do beyond relating bits of the universe to other bits by constructing bigger and better language games. I should welcome this development, and so I am inclined to think that recent philosophy of mind is one of the few areas in which we philosophy professors may actually be doing a bit of good.